What I thought I'd do is just tell you a little story that relates to a song that was sung back in the June meeting. In fact, I think it was sung twice, but I'd left before I heard it the second time. So, quickly, I'm Cameron Laing. I lived in Cruden Bay for about 15 years, from about 93 through to about 2008. I didn't get to know many people because work and social activities were outside the village. But I did get to know a couple of people outside immediate neighbours, and they're people that you'll probably know. There was a renowned bass player, Kenny Mackenzie. Some of you might know him. Occasionally turns up here. And the other guy was Dave Dixon, who was renowned for the biggest smile in Cruden Bay. Anyway, I live in Ellen now, but I'll really enjoy coming back to these meetings. And I came in June, and I heard a song sung by Ailsa Dixon, and it was Generations of Change by Matt Armour. And it really struck me, because I think any great song is universal but personal. It's written in one location, but it's understood in many locations. And so I wanted to tell you a little bit about how generations of change in some ways reflected my life story, my family history. And there's the first verse of Generations of Change includes these lines. Part of the verse says, "He plewed nearly half for the East Neuk of Fife. He feed on at Randerston, Crawhill and Cleffington, Campbell, Carnby and Big Rennie Hill. At Kingsbarn he married, at Boar Hills he's buried. Man, if he'd lived, he'd be ploughing there still." And now these names probably don't mean anything to you guys living up here in the northeast of Scotland. But one of the names stood out to me. It was Carnby, which is a tiny little place just a few miles north of Anstruther in the East Neuk of Fife. And that was where my great-grandfather was born. And my great-grandfather and his family ploughed the fields of the East Neuk of Fife. They feed on at different farms, maybe even every 6 months they move around. And my grandfather, his son, was born in Anstruther, which was at one time the biggest fishing village on the coast of the Firth of Forth, on the south side of the East Neuk of Fife. And my great-grandfather must have done a deal at some feeing mart, and he ended up migrating to Glencarse, which lies between Perth and Dundee. Now, the interesting thing about where he ended up in Glencarse is that it's really within a mile of the Hawk Stave, which, if some of you know your history, will recognise as the legendary boundary stone of the lands owned by the Earls of Errol. You maybe have heard that title before. And the Earls of Errol, now they have migrated over years from Glencarse up to Slains in this part of the world. In fact, the first Earl of Errol to appear in these lands was back in 1308, when they followed Robert the Bruce as he got rid of his competitors for the throne of Scotland, one of which was John Comyn, the Earl of Buchan. And so the Hay family, the Earls of Errol, had followed Bruce at the Battle of Barra in 1308, just south of Old Meldrum, and then later on at Bannockburn. And they were rewarded with the lands taken off the Earl of Buchan. And so the Earls of Errol set up at Slade's Castle. Now, the interesting thing about that bit of history is that I know that my predecessors lived in Glencarse because I've got a book that my grandfather bought when he was living at Nethermains Farm in Glencarse, within a mile from the Hawkstane and the lands of the Earls of Errol. The book was Wilson's Border Tales and Tales of Scotland, which was a very popular book back in the 19th century, before TV and radio. Farmers would gather their children around them in the evening and they would read a story from Wilson's Border Tales. And my grandfather wrote his name in there. You know, Robert Laing, Nethermains Farm, May 1893. Now, 100 years later, to the year 1993, I bought, with the help of a mortgage, the manse, the old congregational manse at the end of Serrell Street, which was on land granted to the Congregational Church of Cruden Bay by the Earls of Errol, and sat within a mile's distance of New Slade's Castle, the seat of the Earls of Errol. So, and here was me, my grandfather having been working on farms, ploughing the horses, just as my armour wrote. And here's me, a petroleum engineer in the oil industry, now here in Cruden Bay and connected somewhat to the Earls of Errol. Now, the bit that's missing from the story, the Matt Armour's song talks about the grandfather working on the farms and the son ends up working on the fishing, and then the grandson ends up working in the oil industry. That's the storyline of the generations have changed. So we've got my grandfather working on the land, we've got myself working on the oil. The fishing bit's a wee bit tenuous. My father worked in the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries for Scotland, but he really looked after seed potatoes, not really the fisheries side. The Congregational Church, when they built the manse and built the Congregational Church, the trustees, 6 of the 8 trustees of the Congregational Church were fishermen. But these are kind of tenuous links. So there is a fishing story in my story, though, and that is somewhat second-hand, but very real to me, because when I started work in Great Yarmouth in 1976, I didn't own a car, I just graduated from university. I was taking the train down to start my first job, and on the last leg of that train journey from Norwich to Great Yarmouth, I remember to this day sitting in a relatively empty carriage. I think the only other person in the carriage was this old lady, who I think was around about 80 years old, and she was from the northeast of Scotland. And she was travelling down to Great Yarmouth to visit with friends that she had made during the days of the herring fishing. The boats sailed down the east coast from Shetland all the way down to Lowestoft, catching the silver darlings. But there was thousands of women and girls who travelled down by train along the coast, meeting up with their menfolk at all the fishing ports, where the men brought the fish in, and the women gutted the fish, salted them, and packed them into wooden barrels. And she was one of those ladies. She made her friends in Great Yarmouth. And when I got to Great Yarmouth and settled in, it didn't take long to hear about the Scottish fishing boats who would not fish on the Sabbath. So on a Sunday, if you wanted to cross from one side of the River Yare to the other, you just walked across from one Scots fishing boat to the next and got to the other side. So the fishing story will continue. So there was Great Yarmouth, but area where the quayside offices that I worked in stood were once covered in barrels of salted herring. A few years later, I ended up working in Trinidad in the West Indies. Now, world apart, but there we did our grocery shopping in a shop that was resonant of the Britain in the 50s or 60s, where you went up to the counter with your order. There was two grocers in the wee community we lived in. One was run by a Chinaman called Chin Hong, and his store was one of these stores where you went up to the counter with your list of messages, and somebody behind the counter would go to the shelves and bring things back. Any of you, I think most people here will remember that. Any of you don't, think about the Four Candles sketch that the two Ronnies did. It was that kind of situation. Only being Trinidad, the counter also served as a bar, so you could have yourself a cool beer while you were waiting for your order to be filled. Now, Chin Hong was an astute businessman, though. He recognised that a lot of the expats, Americans, Canadians, British people who worked there in the oil industry on that end of Trinidad, were some of his best customers, and they were used to picking out their own fresh vegetables and frozen meat and whatever. So he gave us the privilege of going round the back of the store to his cold store and picking out the goods that we wanted to buy there. One day my wife and I were doing that, and I noticed a little wooden box in the corner of this room. And I looked a bit closer and I read the writing on the box. Salt fish from Great Yarmouth. The Trinidadians, the Caribbeans, loved their salt fish. In the days particularly when they didn't have freezers and all these modern conveniences. So there we are. The fish story followed me to Trinidad. But that wasn't the end of it. Eventually came back to work in Aberdeen again. And this was back in the 80s now. And I remember rummaging around some second-hand store in Bankery. And I found some 1934 copies of the National Geographic magazine. You know, the yellow, bordered National Geographic, famous magazine. And in this 1934 edition of the National Geographic was an article when the herring fleet comes to Yarmouth. It was a whole story about the herring fleet in Great Yarmouth in the 1930s, full of pictures of acres of barrels of salted herring, of the girls with their fingers wrapped in string or cloth to protect them from the fish and from the salt and from the sharp knives. And the boats, the steam drifters coming into Yarmouth Harbour with the recognisable PD registration. What's the right word for the registration? It's Peterhead, PD, Peterhead. So you can see Peterhead boats coming into Yarmouth in the 1930s. And goodness knows, the lady that I met on the train coming into Yarmouth in 76 could well have been in the photographs in 1934. So anyway, just to bring it all round, that Generations of Change song really struck a chord with me. So, as I said, universal and personal, and that's my personal story of the farming, the fishing, the oil, all tied up in my personal history with a little bit of Cruden Bay's history thrown in there too. So thank you.